Thank you so much, Stefano Arduini, and I begin with warm thanks to the NIDA Institute, to James Maxey, to Phil Towner for honoring me with this invitation. I would also like to thank Edwin Gensler for his encouragement and his much, much appreciated support. I'm very aware of standing or sitting or speaking in the shadow of Gayatri Spivak, of coming after what must have been a marvelously stimulating series of lectures, and I'll do what I can. What I am proposing is a series of explorations of translations across troubled divides, across a series of cities which each illustrate a specific model of mediation. So I'm going to be beginning with the city of Barcelona, cracked mirrors of the city of Barcelona, where I'm talking about a city of distorted doubles. The next lecture will be about cities at the edge of empire, where I'm going to be talking about two lesser-known cities, Trieste, but especially Czernowitz, which was a city at the extreme east of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I'll be concluding with the city, the politically divided city of Nicosia, where I'll be talking about the intractable divides of violence. So in each case, I will be highlighting the work of women as mediators. And I hope to begin a discussion about the divides of translation, the troubled divides of the cities I'm talking about, but perhaps we can imagine what might be untroubled divides. Are all divides of translation, in fact, troubled divides? Oops, I went backwards. Okay. So this is in guise, in something of a preface. So you have in front of you the most familiar image of the Babel story, Peter Bruegel's 1563 painting of the Tower of Babel, an imposing tower with its Roman Colosseum arches superimposed on the swirling Babylonian ziggurat. The tower is represented in a state of semi-completion, with several edges not yet constructed or else already falling into ruin. For an image that has been for centuries one of the most powerful representations of humanity's second fall, the painting shows a surprising lack of pathos. In fact, this image, which is also by Peter Bruegel, is much darker image, and it's the image that perhaps you remember appeared on the cover of Steiner's famous book. He chose that image, we will assume. So much of the pleasure of the viewing comes, as in many Bruegel paintings, from deciphering the details of the individual acts that make up the anthill-like configuration. There are countless arches and windows and myriad tasks being undertaken. It's not height that dominates in the painting, but the cross-cut perspective moving the eye inward towards ever smaller units. In fact, the painting seems to have a lot more to do with a fascination for human ingenuity and diversity than with a presentiment of tragedy. Art historians confirm that Bruegel's painting does carry more of a utopian message than one of doom, reversing the traditional message of the biblical narrative and rewriting Babel as a polyglot, humanist city. City? It's often forgotten that the site where the tower was built is not an open plain, not the desert, but the biblical phrase being the city and its tower. In fact, the Tower of Babel doesn't appear as a phrase. It appears as the phrase Ha'ir v'hamigdal, the city and its tower. Bruegel's Vienna version is faithful to the biblical text in showing the tower to be part of an already considerable city stretching outwards into the plain. This is no desert. There is a bustling port at the foot of the tower, And this is the surest clue as to the identity of the city. In a still authoritative interpretation of the Babel painting, S.A. Mansbach explains that the Babylonia Occidentalis that is being portrayed in the painting is Antwerp itself, Bruegel's city. And the kingly figure in the foreground, neither Nimrod nor Alexander the Great, but the Spanish king, Philip II. Bruegel's Antwerp was the largest, richest, and most international city of its day, the center of European trade and finance, the host to large communities of merchants from Italy, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, and England. Antwerp sustained a vigorous humanist polyglot culture, and like Venice and Amsterdam, a flourishing publishing industry and an astonishingly wide range of languages. In fact, one of the most distinguished realizations of the period was the Polyglot Bible of May 1572, published by Bruegel's friend, Christophe Plantin, a member of the circle of poets, writers, and artists of liberal-leaning and humanist sympathies that Bruegel frequented in Antwerp. This Bible was a monumental enterprise involving the printing of sacred text in Hebrew, Greek, Syriac, and Aramaic, with translations into Latin and Hebrew. Bruegel's painting, then, celebrates a very deep fascination for his own multilingual city and its polyglot activities, including its humanist practices of translation. But the presence of the ambitious and imperious King Philip in the painting is a reminder that the conflicts of political power loom over the city, as they did over Antwerp. During the late 1550s and 60s, Flanders was under increasingly harsh Spanish domination, and communities of liberal Catholic and Protestant thinkers were under siege. For Mansbach, this is precisely what Bruegel is representing: the flourishing culture of Antwerp under threat by the Spanish king. Indeed, Antwerp will fall. Catholic and Spanish-dominated Flanders was separated from Protestant Holland, leading to the emigration of many Protestants to Amsterdam. The paintings of Rubens will take over from Bruegel. And the printer Plantin would ensure the remarkable longevity of his company by catering to the requirements of the Catholic Church. In fact, his polyglot Bible doesn't contain vernacular languages, only sacred languages. So, Bruegel's painting reverses the received meaning of the Babel episode in two ways. The threat that looms over the city is not divine, but quite human. And second, the consequence of this disaster will not be the splintering of one human language into many, but on the contrary, a narrowing down of the city's cosmopolitanism. The contradictory effects introduced by Bruegel are anticipated by the biblical text itself. And here I'm just reminding you of the famous text by Derrida, who tells us that the Babel story is constructed around one of the Bible's characteristic examples of wordplay, the words Babel and Balal. Therefore was the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the languages of all the earth, Balal. In fact, this is a false identification. Babel, the place name, was named for Balal, the confusion. Why? There's no explanation for this. These are two different words. So Babel received its name because of its false resemblance to the word for confuse or confound, which is a word with Akkadian roots. So a confusion of meanings and a confusion of tongues is inscribed into the very letter of the text. And because of this unruliness, Derrida explains, Babel cannot be translated. The originary mixture puts into question the possibility of separation and equal restitution demanded by translation, just as it questions the meanings put into circulation through faulty wordplay. Is there irony to be read into this foundational mistranslation? And might this irony not open onto conflicting interpretations of what the confusion at Babel was really about? Bruegel's painting, then, can be read as a celebration of the multilingual city, but also as a warning of its fragility. This cycle of making and unmaking, of diversification and simplification, has been amply demonstrated in the life of cities. Certain cities have become legendary as the site of multilingual cultures which did not endure. Toledo in 12th century Spain was not only a city of religious coexistence, but the site of an exemplary enterprise of translation, put to a very radical end in 1492. The cosmopolitan cities of the Levant have similarly assumed a mythical status for the 19th and early 20th centuries as idealized images of cosmopolitan diversity. In fact, they come to illustrate the violent passage from pre-national forms of coexistence to national forms of identity, illustrating the multiple and sometimes contradictory roles of translation. So that's in the guise of a preface to what follows, the Babel story as prefiguring the history of multilingual cities, both in their state of celebration, multiplicity, and in their terrible fragility, the precariousness of this multiplicity, and how cities become particularly eloquent examples of this passage. So, all around the world, cities are rediscovering their underground rivers. In Seoul, Korea, the Cheongyecheon River was rescued from under a 6-lane autoroute and has now become the center of an exquisite linear park flowing through 6 kilometers of the downtown core. According to a recent documentary, London, New York, Toronto, Montreal all have plans to excavate rivers which were covered over during the late Victorian period. There are apparently good ecological reasons to free the rivers, but the symbolic significance is also very strong. Citizens who had no idea that they were treading over tamed, bricked-in streams will now be reconnected with the natural history of their cities, and with a literal reminder of the city as a space of circulation. Cities are given life by what flows through them. What moves through cities? People, ideas, money, traffic, sewage, gossip, news media, rumor, virtual messages, a mixture of visible and invisible streams, circulating in complex patterns of overlay, some random, some following pre-established pathways. Recognition of this reality has made circulation a powerful figure for studying the cultural life of cities. Circulation, I think, is also a useful way to speak about the passage of language through cities, the way languages are always in movement and in contact with one another, sometimes in a hostile, sometimes in a convivial way. In Montreal, for instance, the flow of languages is made up of 2 main tributaries, an increasing number of affluents which flow into one another through translation. This is never a free-floating mélange. The mingling of languages is driven by the forces of history, which can sometimes redirect these currents in surprising and unpredictable ways. And like the modernization projects which have buried rivers underground, languages are sometimes eliminated from cities altogether, entirely silenced, so that the sonorous past of a city becomes entirely unrecoverable. While the visual aspects of city life have been much discussed, the audible surface of languages, each city's signature blend of dialects and accents, is an equally crucial element of urban reality. Just as seeing the buildings and streets of an urban aggregation is crucial to understanding its history, its organization into neighborhoods, its systems of circulation, so hearing introduces the observer into layers of social, economic, and cultural complexity. The waves of languages that flow into one another provide the listener with a rich sensory surface. They merge with particular intensity in border areas, like the noisy streets of polyglot neighborhoods. Yet despite the sensory evidence of multilingualism in today's cities, the scripts on storefronts, the sidewalk conversations, there has been little discussion, sustained discussion of language as a vehicle of urban cultural memory and identity, or as a key in the creation of meaningful, or of translation, as a key in the creation of meaningful spaces of contact. So, briefly, here are 4 elements that I see as framing the conversation about language, translation, and the city, just briefly before I enter Barcelona. So I'll start with the most superficial, literally. Language is the audible surface of the city as part of the sensory landscape. This was a topic introduced by Henri Corbin in relation to the 19th century city. A city's sounds, odors, and movement constitutes its identity as much as the stones of its architecture. Corbin goes on to talk about particularly significant sounds, most famously the ringing of church bells, but also the cries of peddlers and vendors. What is missing, though, is an analysis of the sounds of language as they form the texture of everyday life, as they define the sensibility and the imaginaire of particular cities, whether it be the environment of neighborhoods in Barcelona or the particular music of mixed languages that one hears in parks or markets anywhere in the world. Or as they move through demographic changes and experience the kind of dramatic historical reversals and contribute to the memory of the city. For instance, the city of Thessaloniki today is a Greek-speaking city. But 100 years ago, the languages that filled its streets were Turkish and Judeo-Spanish. Vilnius today is mainly a Lithuanian-speaking city, though few Lithuanians lived in the city before 1945. Russian and Polish are still heard, but not Yiddish, which disappeared. The city that is called Bratislava today had 3 names that were used throughout the period from 1867 to 1914. It had a German name, Pressburg, it had a Hungarian name, Pozsony, and a Slovak name, Presporok. To refer to the city by each of these names, including today's Bratislava, which was a made-up name, it means brotherly love, like Philadelphia, and it only turned up in 1918. So to use one of those names is to project a completely different historical identity on the city. So while events are memorialized, languages are not. Shifting soundscapes alter perceptions of the city, change the everyday lived experience, but also understanding of the past. So how are languages remembered as part of the city's past? What are the effects of reading the history of a city through the lens of one language rather than another? Secondly, the sensory city is not the same as what I call the translational city. Thinking about the city as a translation zone takes us away from an amorphous idea of multilingualism to a more active, directional, and interactional model of translation. It's useful to consider the idea of translation zones, areas of intense interaction across languages, a space defined by a relentless to and fro, by an acute consciousness of relationships, and by the kinds of polymorphous translation practices characteristics of multilingual milieus. All cities have their translation zones, some of which are part of the popular mythology of the city. In Montreal, there's one street called St. Lawrence Boulevard, which is the historic line of demarcation and the historic contact zone. In Europe, I think the train stations are often the most intense contact zones, so the places where migrants meet. I'm not talking about people taking trains. I'm talking about the people who hang around train stations. And use them as sites of conviviality. At certain historical moments, some cities can be especially significant as translation zones, whether they be colonial cities, historically divided cities like Barcelona and Montreal, or what Marcel Cornish-Pope and John Neubauer called nodal cities, the city of Central Europe, which all reflect the special character of multilingual cities in a time of competing nationalisms. Translation does not exclude conflict. I think by now we're aware of that, especially this morning. Thank you. Translation has come down to us as part of a humanistic conception of bridging intolerance, but of course we have been actively in translation studies redefining and widening ideas to include ideas of covert or forced translation. Translation has to include the refusal to translate, zones of silence and resistance. So when we talk about contact zones, we must include non-contact zones. And so I give a very broad meaning to translation itself. Translation could be broadly defined as writing at the intersection of languages writing under the influence of, in the company of, with or often against other languages. So writing at the intersection of languages. A third element to take into account in talking about cities is that of modernity and the aesthetics of dissonance. Zones of linguistic dispossession or insecurity have a special role to play in the emergence of modernist literature. I often like to refer to Claudio Magris, who has, as a writer, has talked very eloquently about Trieste in that context, or someone like Doris Sommer and her bilingual aesthetics in the same way. And then just finally, before the main event, the mediators. So who are the mediators in the translational city? And here's where we come to women as mediators. So mediators are essential figures in the urban landscape, as Michel de Certeau reminds us. As intermediaries, shifters, connecting agents, translators, and dispatchers, they are the anonymous heroes, here I'm quoting de Certeau, of communication, making social space more habitable. Because the actual production of translated text usually takes place in the removes of private space, we do not often visualize the work of translation or the travels that sustain it. And that's why it's necessary to draw portraits of significant individuals who have played this role, to see them gathering information and making connections, moving across language zones, putting languages and texts into circulation, and in particular, moving across cities to do this. So the translators I study all incorporate translation into a broad cultural project, and their activities often exceed the definition of conventional language transfer. So in keeping with the theme of these lectures on translation, culture, and gender, I'd like to emphasize the importance of the role that women have played as mediators and translators. Despite its historical status as a weak and degraded version of authorship, translation has at times emerged as a strong form of expression for women, a way of contesting social and literary constraints and allowing them to enter the public world of authorship. The influential cultural mediators of the early 20th century, Constance Garnett, Willa Muir, Jean Starr Untermeyer, all saw translation as a way of reordering social and literary relations. Constance Garnett, widely known translator of some 60 volumes of modern Russian literature, was an active participant in the political debates of her times and began translating through her sympathy with a group of Russian revolutionary exiles as a result of her Fabian connections. Willa Muir, who with her husband Edwin translated many important European authors, was also an early feminist, publishing in 1925 with Hogarth Press. Contemporary theoreticians of feminist writing have given a strong role to translation as a means of creating new subject positions and enhancing solidarity across languages. Challenging the traditional role of the translator as a neutral mediator, feminist translation drew attention to the agency of the translator, giving her more authority to engage actively with the text. Contemporary feminism has been responsible for opening up lines of communication which do not follow the traditional national routes. Women's writing, for instance, has created new networks of translation and new readerships. And academic feminism has also created its own lines of cultural traffic. The internationalization of feminism has raised important political issues which question the ethical basis of solidarity between first and third worlds. And here, of course, I refer to the work of Gayatri Spivak. But I also wanted to refer to Keith Harvey, like Christian did this morning, whose important work on gay and camp identities investigated the meaning of American gay as it traveled across the ocean, as does Bella Brodsky's very recent work on a further extension of that travel across oceans, because she talks about the return of French feminism via American feminism. So the first movement of translation that we usually think about when we talk about feminism is French theory arriving in America, but then with the translations of Judith Butler and gender theory back into French, we have a new boucle, a new little loop in the ribbon, which allows us to understand, of course, that all these transfers are constantly in a process of going and returning. So be sure to buy a return ticket. No, just take a one-way. So I'll try to show how women translators have occupied the city and drawn new lines of transmission. And so the first city I would like to investigate will be Barcelona, where translation has played an important role in the rebirth of Catalan after its years of prohibition by the Franco regime. So, take a little break. Okay, the city that I would like to read in particular through the lens of gender is Barcelona. As in the other dual cities that I've studied, the friction and complicity between Barcelona's two main languages shape the imaginative landscape of the city. But several aspects of the geography of contact, of course, are unique to Barcelona. Spanish and Catalan are Romance languages, both born in the Iberian Peninsula in the 12th century. And sometimes a single letter can distinguish words in one language from the other, making for a closeness which can be confusing. But while the surface resemblances between the two languages might suggest easy communicability, in fact, the separate oral traditions and the weight of centuries of parallel literary histories add layers of impenetrability. This mix of familiarity and strangeness, closeness and distance, is replicated in the demographic mix of the city, with its double population of native Catalans and immigrant population of Spanish speakers originally from southern Spain who flooded the city between 1950 and 1970. So Barcelona as a Catalan city, but which has a population which is roughly half. It's a very, very double city. Roughly half of immigrants. They're known as immigrants, which is disconcerting for North Americans because for us immigrants are, well, foreign immigrants, but these are immigrants from southern Spain, but they're still referred to as immigrants. Like the languages they speak, these populations are similar and different, sharing their national affiliation, but participating in very different histories. The status of Castilian in Barcelona as a state language means that all Catalans are necessarily bilingual, educated to be able to function in both languages. The history of long years of suppression of the Catalan language, because Franco, during the whole era of Francoism, the Catalan language was prohibited from being spoken, and the precariousness of the language, forced to converse daily with its stronger twin, make for the special character of the Barcelona language scene. Self-translation and the figure of the double take on special significance under these circumstances, and they will be our point of entry into the tumult of Barcelona letters. Translation navigates through subterranean routes whose patterns are similar to the network of passage that honeycomb the city, moving between languages of uneven power, between the confidence of Castilian and the energy of Catalan, forced to ensure the conditions of its own survival. Some symbolic sites take on special importance as nodes or switching points, or by contrast as unruly zones of hybrid identity, like the historic core area known as the Raval, which disturbs Barcelona's long-standing narratives of difference. The fictions of Carme Riera offer rich reflections on translation as it plays through the collective consciousness. Sorry, a little problem here. Okay. The revival of Catalan after the Franco, I'm going to get to Cameriere in a second. The revival of Catalan after the Franco years, which prohibited both the public use of Catalan and the publication of books in Catalan, has involved the marking of both civic and literary space by language. Translation has played a major role in this reconquest. So, I just... talk a little bit about the fact that there's been a huge and very interesting movement of recovery of translations, investigation into the history of translation into Catalan, and women have been especially important in this. And I want to mention Pilar Gudeal, whose work is extremely important in this. And now I'm just going to go back to this lovely cigar-smoking image. So as Pilar Gudeal has shown, writers like Maria Aurelia Campmany represent a spirit of the recovery of Catalan literature. We're talking now mainly the 1960s. There was very strict censorship against publishing in Catalan until the 1960s. And then there was a movement of a very vigorous movement of recovery of Catalan through translation especially. And one of the figures who was very important was this Maria Aurelia Campmany, a vigorous opponent of the regime, an early outspoken feminist. She was one of the first to contribute to this wave of translations in the 1960s, translating in all some 30 writers into Catalan, not only from French, but also from Italian and English, novels of neo-Italian realism, but also thrillers. She was a theater director, actress, and essayist, and she later went on to become an important political figure in the Catalan government. She also wrote works that were inspired by writers she admired, like Virginia Woolf and Simone de Beauvoir, turning translation into a form of rewriting. Her Catalan version of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique is called La Dona a Catalunya. It was published in 1966 and was the first serious modern work devoted to the situation of women in Catalonia, and the basis for several more works by Campmany devoted to women and feminism. These translations contributed to the prestige of literary Catalan through the richness of the vocabulary and the spontaneity of expression. So Campmany is one of the most important representatives of the self-consciously political translator, attempting to give a vigorous refueling to Catalan through translation. The fact that she assumed many literary roles and that she used translation to augment and enable Catalan literature identify her as a translator fully engaged in processes of what I will call furthering, and I will explain that later. Campmany is the most prominent of a culture of women writers who have doubled as translators and whose careers have been investigated and reclaimed by feminist researchers, and that's where Pilar Gudeal I mentioned in particular. There are a number of these very, very interesting women who all seem to have had a similar pattern in the sense that they were not only translators, but they were translational writers. Another writer who was Maria Mercè Marçal was a poet, and like Campmany, she looked to poets like Emily Dickinson, Adrienne Rich, Sylvia Plath, and the well-known French writer René Vivienne as inspiration, and wrote works on the basis of these writers. So not only translated, but used this work to create their own novels, poems. So it's not surprising that the city becomes the domain not only of natural translators, those mythic inhabitants of plurilingual spaces, but of professionals who turn up regularly in Barcelona fiction. So they're not only a history of women translators, but a history of women translators who figure in fiction. Cassandra Riley in Barbara Wilson's Gaudy Afternoon, or the narrator in Mercé Ibar's The City Under Construction. Confusion of languages, identity loss, irretrievable memories, conflictual translations. These are themes that are heavy with meaning in a city still oppressed by a legacy of secrecy. For a nation which has lived through a civil war, the double will have an inevitably sinister quality. The remarkable tradition of crime fiction in Barcelona is no doubt related to the atmosphere of suspicion created by the silences which followed the Civil War. The city is often portrayed as a double realm, a living tableau shadowed by a darker domain. And one of the most intriguing new participants in the genre of crime fiction is Teresa Solana, herself a translator. And if I might introduce a small element of gossip, she's married to Peter Bush, who of course is a very well-known translator. Few novelists have conjugated themes of language and betrayal as effectively as Carme Riera. And this will be the last portion of my talk, where I'll talk a little bit about Carme Riera. So Riera was born and brought up in Catalan-speaking Mallorca, now teaches Spanish language and literature at the University of Barcelona. Though she belongs to the Catalan literary world and writes her books in Catalan, Riera was also educated in Spanish and writes Spanish versions of her own stories and novels. I want to talk in particular about one short story, which is called Mon semblable, mon frère, which is in fact the French from Baudelaire. It's a compelling tale of language and eros, creativity, and imitation. It's an extended fable on the theme of friendship and literary influence across languages. Two childhood friends, one from a family of what are known as the winners, the other of losers, in reference to the Civil War, both become writers and continue to influence one another through their careers. When Raphael writes a series of poems in French, he was brought up as an exile in France, José finds them perfect and spontaneously decides to translate them into Catalan. Raphael takes the poems, the Catalan poems, and publishes them as if they were his own. Then becomes a crisscross of influences and translations between Spanish and Catalan, English and French. Raphael persuades José, this is impossible to understand. I'm going to tell it to you, but you won't follow it. It's impossible to follow. That's kind of part of the story. Raphael persuades José to write his own poetry in Spanish, but when José publishes in Spanish, the book of poems is a flop. Then Raphael translates the poems from Spanish back into Catalan and receives an enthusiastic response. Critics understand Raphael to be the original writer and condemn José as the imitator. Raphael becomes a hugely successful poet. José is ignored. The love-hate relationship between the two men, with a hint of homosexuality, continues throughout their lives until Raphael dies and is given the honors of a national funeral. José goes on to pursue a career as a painter. Adopting familiar devices from the postmodern repertory, the story explores the enigma of originality. It uses translation as a key to understanding the interindebtedness of literary traditions in general, but of the Catalan writer in particular. Though Raphael receives the more enthusiastic critical reception, he's in fact derivative, an imitator. We are led to understand that originality resides in the unknown and less celebrated friend. The fact that translations produce novelty, an idea that is, of course, very Borgesian, is an important element of the story. José's poetry is ignored when he publishes it in Spanish, but celebrated when it reaches Catalan. Raphael's poetry is considered banal, déjà vu in France, but well received when it's translated into Catalan. And so the work acquires new value as it crosses literary borders, becoming news to a tradition where its particular lessons were not yet learned. Riera's story becomes all the more intriguing when we learn that her tale is based on two actual Barcelona poets, one named Jaime Gil de Biedma, the other Gabriel Ferraté. Riera became familiar with the work of both these poets as she was working on her doctoral thesis, which is an extremely detailed study of what's called the School of Barcelona. Riera lists the university halls, bars, and literary meeting places which became the haunts of these poets. She describes their friendships and rivalries, their acts of political courage and compromise, debates, and influences which moved them along the path to literary fame. In introducing the Spanish language poet Jaime Gil de Biedma, she evokes, among his other friendships, his friendship with Gabriel Ferraté, known as a brilliant writer whose short career achieved a remarkable synthesis of Catalan and international influences. He committed suicide as he announced he would at the age of 50. Between 1955 and 1958, the relations between these two poets were extremely intense. They were united by intelligence and brilliance, by their common predilection for alcohol, and by their interest in English culture. They both admired the same poets, etc. While Gil de Biedma never strayed from Castilian, Ferraté wrote in Catalan. He translated Kafka in particular. And so Riera's elaborations on translations have a basis in the oeuvre of Ferraté. Her fictionalization of these doublings between the two represents the specific case of two writers in intense cross-language conversation, and the more general case of the cross-influences that stimulate Barcelona literature. But this is the point. Riera argues that the influence of one over the other resulted in parallel results in two neighboring and distinct languages. She calls her story a literary wink at this group of poets who closely resemble one another. If the two had written in the same language, she said, they would have been the same poet. Because what they say and how they say it, the tone of their work, the verse forms, are so similar. The lives of these two poets, each half of an entire universe of expression, seems impossible to imagine anywhere else than in Barcelona. But the story is more than a simple allegory of the Barcelona literary scene. It also serves as the core of the creative impulse that extends to other novels by Riera. In fact, the theme of the double operates in all her work. And the doubling of Riera's novels spiral into additional turns when her own Castilian novels are translated into Spanish. And I will just go to the main point here. Because as a postmodern writer, Riera has reflected on her own practice as a self-translator. And central to her thinking is the distinction between translation and rewriting. For her own work, she speaks not of, in fact, of translation, but of rewriting. This difference results not only, most relevant to the personal experience of language doubling is the description she gives of the ideal creative process. This is the process she adopted while working on her 1987 epistolary novel, Questions d'amour-propre. For this book, she actually wrote and translated at the same time. Doubling the process of imaginative creativity and allowing herself a constant second point of view on her own text. She became a critical reader of her own text, more distanced and able to correct the aspects of her text that seemed less pertinent. This double performance, which brings into being parallel literary selves, is richly evocative. It vividly materializes the image of the postmodern writer as a double of herself, hearing the echo of her imagination as she moves back and forth across the space of language. So she actually speaks about her creative process as writing the two versions at the same time. The doubleness also provides a critical position, a way of being both inside and outside of the work. This position puts Riera in the company of such contemporary writers as Nancy Houston, for whom self-translation represents an aesthetic and even a moral stance, a desire to be inscribed in more than one literary tradition and to participate in a cosmopolitan sensibility. Riera could claim then, as Isaac Bashevis Singer did in relation to his English versions from the Yiddish, that her writings in Castilian take the form of a second original. Self-translations are absolved from the strict contractual relations of ordinary translation. The writer is author of both texts, and therefore not obliged to conform to conventional notions of equivalence. And yet, of all forms of translation, self-translation is perhaps most open to accusations of betrayal. That the writer sometimes engages in double dealings for reasons of writerly gain make the operation all the more suspicious. Rabindranath Tagore earned himself the Nobel Prize by translating his Gitanjali into English, as did I.B. Singer, Isaac Bashevis Singer, for his translations from Yiddish. Though celebrated for their contributions to English language literature, these writers were also resented by their original language readers for the ways in which they simplified or distorted the richness of their own cultural worlds. More so perhaps than for high modernist writers like Beckett, these more socially based writers were expected to remain faithful to the cultural worlds out of which they wrote. So too in Barcelona, self-translation carries the risks of betrayal that lurk in the passage between two very different conceptions of a home readership. By blurring the boundaries between writerly roles, by obscuring the relations between original and derivative products, self-translation is a particularly effective kind of furthering. It is an activity which is literally without end, as each version can serve as the motor for a subsequent rewriting. Rather than using the work of another as inspiration and platform, the writer turns inwards, finding in their doublings of language and consciousness the material for newly unfolding dramas. So, with their imbrication of postmodern writing and translation, Riera's stories and novels are compelling representations of Barcelona's language passages. The chain of language transactions which extend from the conception of literary work to overlapping processes of translation and diffusion is a distinctive form of translation fostered by the double city. Riera evokes a scene of shifting and pulsing languages and of friendships and rivalries still dark with mystery. There is anxiety on the borders where memories meet. Far from the bustle of Barcelona's crowded streets and landmarks, her novels take more tranquil, interior paths of exploration. The double becomes the disquieting representation of a reality which resists single and definitive truths. Riera calls upon translation to represent doubling effects which have a powerful psychic impact and which come to haunt the symbolic sites of the city itself. The changing values attached to language, the tensions expressed in the social effects of translation, these contribute to the dynamics I've been trying to capture in the life of cities. They are at play in the creation of a literature of contact, when the language borderlines of cities become privileged sites of modernity. It is because these cities were divided that their languages can be appropriated, dislocated, remobilized. A literature of contact derives its power from the special character of urban life, where the coexistence and competition among meaning systems heightens awareness and appreciation of difference. The continual interference among languages, already present in the primordial narrative of Babel, cannot guarantee immunity from global sameness or violent forms of political hegemony. But the co-presence of languages and institutions, uneven in the values they represent and the histories they replay, turns the city's translation zones into productive territories of the imagination. Thank you.